So it's also nicely split up. This is the research side, this is the practice side. So maybe I'll start with the research side first. Is how did you decide to work on these projects that are not necessarily just research, but also looking at the societal problems?
So I'm a strong believer of applied research having sufficient challenges to actually inspire research problems. So when the initial push was because I was always fascinated by wildlife. But as I learned more and more about how this monitoring process is actually done, there were challenges, some which were naturally occurring. For example, small sample. I talked about small sample data and domain adaptation type problems, and some which were kind of initiated by me. I mean, maybe you could call it force fitting. Like one of my slides showed topology and 3D modeling of animals, which is probably not absolutely necessary, but it could be shown as a nice, application over here. So I think, even if you're approaching it from an application point of view, there are challenges which do require research.
Okay, mine was, again, I think like him, it's a very personal decision. There comes a time where, at least in my case, I've been doing whatever hardcore research and stuff, but you also realize that a lot of that work, you don't really see it being used. So it just gets published and people are reading about it. Again, that's a very small, close-knitted, whatever kind of a thing. So, so maybe 10 years back, I had this realization that that kind of work does not give me much satisfaction, and I should work on something that is more relevant. And it's not that, as he also said, that when you start working on some of these problems, you do realize that there's a lot of technology that can assist in solving some of these problems. And for this, your technical background in terms of being able to identify what is the right problem statement, right technology solution, starting from right technique, what are the trade-offs, all that your training that you have undergone as part of your PhD and as part of your earlier research fits in quite nicely within this as well. So even though you're working on some stuff which is not the state of the art, really pushing the envelope in that space, here the problems are different, but the training, I think, works equally well in this thing. So that's been my...
Yeah, sometimes these problems also challenge us to be very honest with the techniques we apply and how we evaluate them,
yes,
which is pretty nice. Maybe I can flip the question to you, Purvi. So Pratham has been a very large NGO for a long time, right? When did you decide that you needed research or sort of these different kinds of technology support? And then how do you reach out? And how as academics, I think we should think of reaching out to an organization like Pratham?
So this reaching out aspect is very new. In fact, it started out with the MSR collaboration, and quickly we are learning that there's a lot of value in it. For us, technology we always see as, we approach it from the user's end, right? So we see if there is a problem and how is the best way to solve it. So in my journey with Storyweaver, what I saw is that again and again we are seeing that there is an issue with quality in translations, right? So how do we empower the community? And what are the processes? So we first try the painful way, and then we are learning really quickly that there are better ways to do it. And I think that's why I had one slide where, very quickly we've gone ahead with recommendation engines, with auto tagging, very simple, quick ways to actually, enhance the user experiences with the end goal of ensuring that a meaningful product comes out of it. And now, even with this image thing that we are talking about, right, I think there is huge value in collaborating with academia there, or with text-to-speech, speech-to-text. All of these, actually, it's quite exciting, right? This one product, Storyweaver, actually cut across so many different, whether it's NLP, text-to-speech, speech-to-text, or image, it cut across all the technologies. So there is a lot of scope to collaborate.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I mean, I actually was interested in working on a routing problem, honestly. I mean, my master's thesis was in a routing protocol. I thought I'll extend it to do a PhD. So I was looking at problems where I could apply routing, and I stumbled into air pollution, and now I've left routing behind. I don't think I'm ever going to get into routing again. And I've realized routing is not even relevant, actually, because I mean, it is relevant, of course, but, for me now, I'm running a startup, and I'm actually enjoying it. So I've shifted domains from that space into application.
Great. Maybe we have short of time. I'll ask one sort of final question, and I'll let all of you jump in. Is that one is the sort of prototype phase, or the phase where you build a technology and put it out, maybe even evaluate it. But then comes this question of scale or sustained impact even after years that you've done the work. So I just want to get your perspective on either maybe take examples of your projects and how you've sort of ensured some sort of a sustainable impact, or what could be certain challenges in doing that?
Okay, so I do a lot of projects which are useful for the society kind of projects. So one of the things that I've realized over the years is especially the research community has a tendency to work independent of this user requirements and stuff. So they come up with some idea, they say, oh, this is very exciting, let me build it. And then they do it, and then they say, okay, let me take it and see who wants to use it. I think that approach maybe may work in some cases, but in most cases I've found that that is not the right way to take things forward. So the recent, whatever we have been working on, at least the projects that I tend to work on, from the idea phase itself, I tend to chalk out to see who are the end users who are going to benefit from this, get them into conversations from the beginning, and I even, in some projects maybe I don't quite do it, but majority of the projects I work with the commitment from their side that I will build this, you have to use it. Only then I will build it, otherwise I'm not interested. And a lot of times if the idea is very appealing and they see something that it will be advantageous to them, they do come on board. There is especially what I've also seen is like a lot of these people, the field workers or the NGOs, they are quite scared of technology. So especially when you approach them and but at the same time they also feel for the need for the technology because they think that it is going to solve some of the problems. So I haven't had that hard a time getting these people on board just because they do, of course maybe the IIT Bombay tag also helps. But nonetheless, so I think that is something that helps you scale because you're connecting with the right people who have the right expertise, the field work, whatever, they have the right connections. That way, I think it's much easier to take your stuff out onto the field if you make the right partnership at the beginning of the project, not at the end.
Right. So I'll just add a little bit to that. And this was a discussion I was having with Ronak earlier today. So so basically, the way I approach this is to build AI systems which are augmenting existing human capabilities, and that's how I think it's also scaling it up. So for example, the work that I'm doing with WII, there are already experts who understand big cats and their nature and everything. But there are only a few of them, and they're overwhelmed by the amount of data that they have to deal with. So just building a system which can actually learn from them and assist them in automating it. I think that that kind of domain expertise, if we can actually build AI systems with such domain expertise, then scalability is just, that's what we are targeting.
Scalability, I think, actually, I would say, collaborations actually would be a reason, honestly, because if you try to do everything yourself, it's a mess. And I've actually left data sciences, honestly, to the experts. There are aerosol scientists I work with, and there are other companies I know, there are US-based companies which have tried to have everything in-house actually. You know, they buy the reference grade equipment, which is a $20,000 equipment. They hire the data scientists. I mean, I don't know, maybe that model also works, but I mean, for me at least, I think having collaborations with the people, and yeah, I guess that would be one of the reasons why it has worked.
Yes, we are hearing collaboration, and especially with organizations who have domain expertise. So Purvi, maybe I can ask you this. So probably Pratham is an exception. You already have such an extensive technology platform and awareness. But you're aware how, in general, other NGOs are in respect to technology. So how should people who have expertise in data science or technology approach these organizations? And what would you tell us in terms of approaching?
I think one good starting point would always be to ask, what is your biggest pain point, right? And kind of understanding that. And once you start from that perspective, right, you're then solving for a larger problem. I do want to, react to the earlier question that you asked, and what he said is we've also taken a similar approach. We've actually said that we understand the child, we understand language, and we understand storybooks, right? So for implementation, we have a very strong tech partner. So it's completely outsourced. Similarly, all the things that we will be doing in AI will be outsourced. It won't happen in-house because we believe we have a certain understanding of domain, and we want to continue focusing on that, the organizational energies on that. Equally, there are times I think that you have to, like Kameshwari said, say no. So one of the things that I always get asked for the platform is that, with this whole thing on animated books, right? Why don't you all do animated books, right? It's such a great way to engage the child. But actually, if you go back to research on how a child learns to read, it's probably the biggest disservice you could do to a child is to hand him or her an animated book. So I think if you, if the organization, the non-profit partners, if they have a very clear goal and vision of why they are doing what they are doing, and you approach the problem area from that spirit, then you can have everything, whether it's collaboration or whether it's technology or whether it's a data problem, right? Everything can be solved from that perspective. And again, one big urge to please release everything under open. We really struggle with technologies because we can't invest in NLP. We can't invest in those technologies. They are there. You talked about imaging technologies. I heard about a similar project with dugongs in, I think, the Pacific. And I'm sure that they're using similar technologies, right? But I'm not very sure on how much. One big move is having the data sets under open, right? That's one big move. But also some of the technologies, because it's both.
Great. So maybe one question or one or two questions from the audience.
Hi, I was wondering if some of you could comment on the use of crowdsourcing in solving some of these problems that you're trying to address. And I haven't attended the talks from yesterday, but the panel here was very interesting. And so I agree that a lot of these approaches of using AI to solve these problems have merit and have value, but most of this is very researchy still, and AI, of course, doesn't have complete solutions to a lot of these problems, as most of you indicated. And crowdsourcing, I think, is a huge tool available to a country like India. I mean, one power that India has is people, and we are still at a point where we don't seem to have leveraged crowdsourcing significantly enough to solve some of these large societal problems. So if you have any thoughts, I mean, I think Kameshwari hinted a little bit on how she's, and of course Pratham Book seems to be using crowdsourcing in some forms. But for things like, and maybe even your efforts are initial stage on those fronts, but if you have more thoughts on that and how we could use a suitable combination of machine-based approaches to addressing hard problems and some crowdsourcing, exploiting so any thoughts on that?
So, of the 5 active projects that I run, 3 are crowdsource based. So I mean, I rightly agree that some of the problems, if you want a solution that works. So, for example, there was a lot of talk of data collection, and in many domains. And it, especially in Indian language, like you see organizations like Google or many others, they're basically, they hire a lot of people, get the data from them or pay money for it. But a lot of times in settings like India or whatever work you want to do, you want labeled data, it's very difficult for you to get because of course, you kind of need money, but there is also this, with crowdsourcing comes sometimes this intrinsic motivation, which may or may not work, where you can tap on people who are generally want to work towards this cause. So crowdsourcing, I think, is a very useful tool. I extensively use it in many of my projects, including, so I have one project on building data sets for speech to text. That is, it's an app that we have built that relies extensively on crowdsourcing, where we are trying to explore what motivates the crowd. I mean, is it money? Is it, by the way, crowdsourcing need not, a lot of times it is just about money or intrinsic motivation where you want to, but there are also ways in which you can use crowdsourcing. For example, in one of the projects we are looking to see, this NSS is a very big organization. A lot of students have to do, it is compulsory for your, as part of your engineering. Use it to generate, and these are all engineering students who have the right expertise in using smartphones and all. So you build a crowdsource, mobile-based crowdsource platform, leverage them, get some data out of, label data out of them. I mean, there are those ways of crowdsourcing as well. So, yeah. So.
I think one thing I've seen in the pollution space is that there is a lot of wisdom on the ground. Honestly, I would rephrase the crowdsourcing to kind of tapping into the crowd wisdom, because honestly, the people know what to do and how to fix the problem. You know, the data, of course, is highlighting, you know, where the issues are. But I would say that, you know, because there's a massive source apportionment program that is starting along with University of Washington, and, you know, there's going to be hundreds of crores going down. Actually, people know what the sources of pollution are. You know, the chemical characterization equipment will tell you what percentages are, but people know what the road dust is and what the, you know, stuff is. So I would say if you can build a mechanism to tap into what they know, rather than looking at them as a, you know, place to just get information and data, if you can get their insights and give them something back, you know, crowdsourcing without giving back, I think is not fair. So you'll have to build a complete model where you give something back to them. It doesn't have to be monetary, of course. There are many non-monetary ways of giving back to the people who are contributing, but that model needs to be built. And I know weather.com did an excellent job in rolling out thousands of personal weather stations using a gamified model of, you know, how good your equipment is maintained. So, I mean, I'm looking at some of those models, you know, I think gamification can play a role where you improve the quality of on-the-ground sensing. But yeah, there's definitely scope for that.
Thank you for asking that question. I think it's really important that we recognize that, and given that we have so many people, this crowdsourcing can bring in so much of data. And there are several examples which are going on where people are trying to actually use AI techniques to sort of understand the data better, which is coming in. And I mean, one example is Professor Sunita and Professor Ganesh from IIT Bombay, the Ventor application, which basically allows people to upload images, text, notes about problems that they face from day-to-day life. And that, I mean, if my understanding is correct, it kind of tries to summarize it and bring it to the municipal corporation, which is typically resource constrained, and they optimize their priorities and address those challenges. And similarly, there have been multiple discussions about crowdsourced traffic violation reporting. For example, Uber, Ola, all these, they always have their phones already on. And can they actually report incidents like accidents or red light jumping and things like that? So I think there's a tremendous potential. On the other hand, it's a big AI challenge as well, because you know, crowdsourced data is noisy. It's, there could be biases which we have to be cognizant of, and design techniques, you know, which do not take too much of effort in building models, so semi-supervised learning or active learning type of approaches, which can actually help in that case. But I mean, one important aspect of it would be what kind of biases do these data bring in. So, but I think that's a huge problem, and a very interesting research having a very interesting research aspect to it as well.
With that, we end our session. I'd like to thank our speakers.